Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special legal compliance webinar session that our law firm Kaizen Synergy is running. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. This session focuses on what is COVID normal and focuses specifically on the second question to that, which is what are my agency's legal compliance obligations? With it, before I get into the agenda, I will just pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So with this, I will add that there are no silly questions that people can ask, and it has been one of the most popular sessions that we have been running since February. With that, we have just about every possible not-for-profit agency from around the country being represented today. We have agencies in health, education, religious services, community law services, Aboriginal services, agencies representing museums, arts, cafes, food banks, and a range of services. Some of these agencies have been closed up until today. Some of them have contacted us back and said, look, they're looking at opening next year. And some are continuing to deliver services as they've done throughout this year as well too. But no matter where you are across this spectrum of agencies, with it, the new COVID normal is something that agencies are clearly very concerned about. We have also opened up via email and also phone lines, asking people to submit any questions that they had to form and shape part of this webinar as well too. I will be covering the legal compliance areas of what to look for. We'll be talking about case studies that other agencies have done and what works and what doesn't work as well too. But also, really from this, we've seen that many agencies have turned round to us, and I'll summarize a lot of the questions. We've had a huge number of agencies join the session today, and with that, there were a number of overlapping questions that people have raised, and some of those are listed here. Most of the emails that we got back started with, my biggest concerns are. And I welcome any questions that you have in today's session, and I'll come to those as well. Some of this was around cleaning, focusing on that people are and agencies that are attending this session are from the not-for-profit part of the sector, and with that have very limited funding and resources, but looking at, well, what does it mean to manage cleaning? Where do we get the guidelines from? What about dinner and volunteer events? How do you actually manage registrations around this? We have had a number of religious agencies talking about gatherings and ceremonies and asking things like, well, if we're allowed groups of 20, but the total venue capacity is 100, but we have to have this density quotient of 1 per 4 square meters, how does that apply to groups of 20 as well? So there are questions around how do we actually take some of these rules that we're seeing and actually apply it to our current services. People also asking questions around, well, how do we run a register if we've got to clean the pens between people actually signing up for our event and registrations as well? Do we need to clean the paper as well? How does that work? But also people also asking, well, now that we are looking at returning to work, can we use the government COVID app that's being publicised by the Commonwealth government? Can we actually make that mandatory for staff to use? But also some really broad questions that we've seen as well too from agencies joining us today saying, look, how can we just keep up to date with this stuff? The rules seem to be changing so often, so quickly. Even with the easing of restrictions, that's causing a lot of confusion. People returning to work, what does that look like? How do I know whether we're doing the right thing? And equally, how long do I need to do it for? And these are some of the questions that these are the questions that we're going to cover today. With it, one of the things that we are going to talk about is what does the COVID normal look like? There are a range of different research papers that we'll refer to. One of them is from Associate Professor Jonathan Lieberman, which we acknowledge, which we've taken the next couple of slides from, which really talks about with governments bringing in strict measures to control the spread of COVID-19, there's a growing sense that the new post-emergency normal may be very well different to what we have known in the past. And so what we've seen is that the law has encroached into literally virtually all aspects of our lives, wherever we live or reside in Australia, that were previously unimaginable. I mean, going back 12 months, who could have foreseen that cafes, restaurants, pubs, cinemas, concert halls, beaches, and places of worship would have been closed, legal restrictions that would have been imposed on the number of people we could have at weddings or funerals, or that governments would prescribe, quite literally prescribe by law, the circumstances in which we are actually permitted to leave our homes. So that said, when you look at what people are calling this new normal, obviously, in time the virus will pass, but at least as an emergency, we will go back to a, inverted commas, normal recordings of lives, but having lost people we know and love, whether to the virus itself or to other conditions, because in some ways, we've seen with some of the clients that we support, especially in the health and community services, there is a focus at the moment clearly on COVID-19, but equally some of the raises in mental health conditions as well too. Other chronic diseases is also on the rise because of the focus and resourcing to COVID-19, certainly this year. But there is also this growing sense that the new normal may be very different from what we have known, and that the longer this crisis lasts, the more different really the new normal will be. So one of the things that we wanted to look at from this webinar is to not only give you some of the key legal compliance obligations that you should be across within this space, but also look at, as we return to work and businesses reopen, we need to ensure that agencies have a robust compliance system in place. Your policies and procedures are in place to support this, but equally acknowledging from a legal compliance point of view that these need to be enough to keep your staff and personnel and people safe, but also not be so onerous or confusing that people kind of throw their hands up and go, oh, this is all too hard around it. And so there is, we need to identify kind of where this line is and what can we do. So one of the things we say by attending our webinars that we have run since February is by attending this legal webinar, you'll get copies of the slides that we are running today. You'll also get a timely collection of resources that your company, staff, volunteers, and clients you provided services to can run. You'll see what COVIDSafe systems and activities other companies in the not-for-profit sector, and I'll focus on that, have been doing that is actually working. So what have other agencies like yourselves been doing, let's go back since February, that is actually working and continues to work and evolve as we move into this next phase of COVIDNormal. And we'll also focus on two different case examples of what has worked and what continues to work as well. So just a few housekeeping items, as I've mentioned. This webinar is being recorded all the way up to the question and answer part of the session, where we will open up the phone lines and obviously question lines as well too, and more than happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that you might raise throughout the session. You can ask questions in the chat group as well too, and we've already had another person just ask the same questions. These slides will be and recordings will be made available to all attendees after this session today, including the resources as well. The webinar information will also be published on the Gemba 360 YouTube channel, and you can view that directly from here. This is our website. You can view, we've also got the knowledge base. When you click on that, it's the kaizensynergy.com address, and that's linked on all our information and slides. And you can go back and actually have a look at our information and sessions. Also, we have equally made it also public on the YouTube channel here. And this actually has all our past webinars, which we have made public thanks to the agencies that have also supported this and shared their information as well too. And that is certainly there for you to access and use as well. As I've mentioned, all materials referred to will be circulated, including these slides. You do have access to the knowledge base with the weekly circulars to attendees here. And if you do have any questions, even after the webinar, by all means, you can reach out to us, and our contact details are listed here. The other resource that you will also be getting as well too, which we will show you, is access to a dashboard for a single seat for your agency to actually use and get all these resources and tools and things like this that we've seen as well too. And I'll come to this as well too at the end of the session. There is the dashboard which covers cleaning requirements, COVIDSafe plans, information that you can also utilize, and a couple of the case studies will also build into this of what we've done. And you'll see some of the QR code brochures down the bottom, and also on the top left-hand side, mobile apps as well too, which I'll talk about of what agencies have actually done from a legal compliance point of view. With that said, I'd like to acknowledge two of the agencies that we will be referring to, and also some of the learnings that have come out of them. They are very different real-life case studies. One is Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative, and we acknowledge Laurie Seville, the Chief Operating Officer out there, and also Women's Housing Limited and Judy Line, the Chief Executive Officer there. Two very different agencies, which I will come to in terms of the services that they deliver and what also they've done as well in terms of how they've managed it. The common ground is the legal compliance works that both agencies have done in grounding the works and being able to manage their reporting and protections for staff as well too, right across this process. So let's look at today's agenda. We're going to focus on what is COVIDNormal and some of the legal compliance frameworks. We're going to look at two parts. One is what your legal compliance obligations are and how they've evolved and where they actually arise from. We're also going to look at specifically some of the workplace legal compliance areas as well too, under fair work legislation, and what you also need to consider. And this stems into the HR requirements as well as work health and safety requirements that your agency needs to look at. Out of that, there will be a structured process around your plan, policy, pandemic forms and monitoring, and joining this together, not just from telling you, hey, look, this is what the law or legislation says at this point in time, but also look broadly across, well, what are the systems in place that will make it simpler for you to manage your agency within its COVIDNormal and also your legal compliance obligations. Some of the what we call coronavirus and Australian workplace laws cover these, everything from returning to work to also alternative work arrangements, stand downs, and ending employments. When we mention about personnel here, we will cover off employees, but also volunteers, members and board members throughout the session, because obviously being in the not-for-profit sector, it is a very different group of personnel that your agencies will use. Now, one of the things I did want to cover briefly, which we've done in other sessions, is to say, starting off with your COVIDSafe plan. Agencies, wherever you are along the spectrum around whether you're effectively looking at reopening or are continuing to deliver services, what is important is that you look at your COVIDSafe plan. And a lot of agencies have said, look, we do have a COVIDSafe plan in place. What has come up though is that when we talk about this, a lot of agencies will focus on these 4 measures. These include essentially ensuring staff are kept safe, the community services are supported and delivered, it'll address your changing business services, and also access to continue to deliver services. And a lot of the time when we see the premiers stand up and start to talk about COVID-safe plans, these are the 4 items that they will say in one shape or another. However, one of the things that our law firm looks at, though, is to say your COVID-safe plan should do something also importantly as well too. And that should make sure that your company meets its legal compliance obligations. And that includes under work health and safety laws, public health laws, privacy and fair work, just to name a few. And the reason I say that is this part of the work of the plan is not something that gets votes. So often politicians and governments will leave that not for things to look at. But for an agency, your COVID-safe plan is important. It's a thing that departments, we have seen already in the past few months, state health departments for those agencies that have been open have called for from time to time. We've seen it in hotspot agencies. We've seen it where agencies have been simply called up the day before and said, by health department, show us your COVID-safe plan. And potentially if they don't follow it or they don't have it, then fines have been issued. There is also talk of class actions against some private aged care services. It's been in the media about judicial inquiries into the government management of hotel quarantine. So this is very real. It's not just from a public health response to COVID-19, but is actually something that your agency needs to carefully consider as part of its COVID plan to make sure that your agency meets these requirements, but also ensures that it meets its legal compliance areas. Now, it is important because COVID-19 will be with us for some time. So it's important that your business has a plan and continues to plan to keep your workplace healthy and virus-free. And one of the things that we've informed agencies about going back right through till since February, and you'll see these if you watch any of our past webinars, is that there is an obligation under directors and officers to exercise due diligence. And this existed before COVID-19. Now, in relation to COVID-19, due diligence means you must acquire and keep your knowledge, in this case of COVID-19 situation, up to date. And this means including webinars or attending webinars like this, as well as following advice from authoritative sources such as the Australian Government, Department of Health, and check for any daily updates, as well as ensure work health and safety hazards and risks are managed, and also including how COVID-19 could affect your workplace. And this is the space that we're in now when we're looking at, well, what do we actually need to do in terms of returning and to work and also within a COVID normal workspace. So let's actually explain this and look at these legal obligations by looking at the laws and the case studies around this. Now, to show you how quickly things can change, this is what affected Rumballara Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative only a few weeks ago. So this was back in September and then sent out and affected that almost a 2 or 3 week range. But without getting in on the details, and yourselves, if you want to have a look at these slides afterwards, you can go through and read exactly what happened as well too, and look at the timeline. But essentially what we have here is listed the timeline of how quickly one person that was COVID positive, essentially, I'm going to say for a better word, shut down an entire suburb and affected a number of businesses and literally thousands of people across a whole spread down in Victoria. So from the 21st, effectively somebody went and travelled from a shopping centre in Chadstone in the southeast part of Victoria, and then travelled all the way to the north. And what we see is that within essentially from the 21st of September through to the 1st of October, there were a whole range of people affected. Outbreaks were tested, state health departments moved into an area, and then essentially up to 37 cases were linked to one person as well. And out of that, 57 people on the 15th of October were actually infected from the start to the end of the outbreak. And it was lucky that it wasn't actually a lot bigger. Now, what we saw in this case was essentially an agency where they had from 0 or no cases to literally 24 hours later, the Department of Health moving into the suburb. So it is something that how quickly things can change. And as borders start to reopen around states and territories around Australia, then potentially we are seeing a potential open of community transition. And we know some agencies, especially in the health area and aged care services, are already talking of their preparations for a third wave in some areas as well too, and potentially flagging this after the Christmas and early New Year's period in terms of what is happening. So that said, how do we then manage this from what's the overlap and management from a workplace laws point of view? How do we manage our HR systems? How do we manage our risk areas? How do we identify this from ensuring that what we have in place to what our legal obligations are? And what we saw at this agency was this case study. Essentially, Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative had the compliance dashboard in place, their COVIDSafe dashboard in place. And this is a resource that your agency is going to be able to get with all of the materials today. They had their plan in place around what they did. We're going to unpack this. They had access to their policies. They had staff trained in the certain space of what to do. They had a series of pandemic forms that already staff are screening, and they've been screening these pandemic forms literally daily in their case, right back to February, where staff, before they come into work, are effectively doing a very quick screening process, and they're able to very quickly gauge whether there's been any change that's occurred. Keep in mind that Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative has a number of staff. They're working across 200 or 300 odd staff in this case. In terms of the services they deliver is in the medical space, in justice space, in aged care services, being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service. They also are equally identified as a vulnerable community. So they took it upon themselves to actually have staff being screened. Now, from a work health and safety point of view, this is where I'm going to say, rather than just saying, oh, look, the work health and safety laws require you to ensure a safe work environment, what does that actually look like? How do we actually put a system in place to allow this to happen? Well, by using the screening tools, allow you to identify very quickly any of the symptoms that staff may show. And with that, they're essentially screening people every day around this. Now, I will say that Women's Housing Limited, because of the type of services that they deliver, get staff to do it once a week. But by doing that process, essentially what they've got is a very active screening process to identify any system changes and symptom changes for their staff and other personnel. Equally, staff have been trained around what they need to do as well too. There are clear policies in place, which I'll show you, as well as some of the registers and risk reporting as well. So with it, you can see that essentially by running systems around stuff, you can actually simplify and contain your legal compliance obligations. Now, we have a number of new agencies joining us from all around the country today. I just wanted to show you what our law firm has done just around it. Purely, this is not a selling point. This is just facts about what we've done over the last few months around things, as well as dating back a number of years. So with that, we've onboarded some over 2,000 companies back in February, and that number has literally tripled over the last few months around the COVIDSafe Plan and what agencies have been using the dashboard, COVIDSafe dashboard for, and our resources, which we're delighted to actually have them open and everyone gets a single seat to be able to access this dashboard. And if you are listening to this webinar afterwards, you can certainly do that. As part of setting up this law firm some 10, 15 years or so ago now, with it, I looked at, and this was my law firm that I actually set up while working in some of the other legal firms, I saw that the only people that could actually understand legal advice was other lawyers. And really some of this stuff we needed to just simplify the law around what are your basic legal compliance obligations that you need to know about. And this was even before COVID. What we have now since then, we're delighted to say that we've received a number of awards that includes even family paintings from Aboriginal agencies, and also now the Gemba 360 platform has been widely used and grown to support a range of agencies around the country. It is equally accessible via mobile device, and you'll have access to this as well too as a single seat to actually use this. There is a license fee if you want to expand this out, but it's there as a resource to actually use for your agency as well. And that's all that I'll say on that side of it. In terms of managing your legal compliance, and let's go back to why you are actually here around this, managing your legal compliance obligations. Now, this focused on a 3-step framework that the Prime Minister announced a number of months ago. And you would have seen this document. So every agency that is open and continuing to run as part of this should be having workplace develops a COVIDSafe plan. And that's irrespective of where you are along this gradient, step 1, step 2, or step 3. But what does that actually look like? Well, when you look at the myriad of legal compliance obligations, there's, I'm going to say, everything from a lot of information out there to feeling like there's not very much. And there's roadmaps, there's templates, there's industry plans, there's the COVIDSafe app, there's information from SafeWorks, there's a biosecurity legislation, there's omnibus legislation, there's posters, all kinds of stuff that is actually out there in terms of returning to work and registers that you're meant to know and follow. What we have done around this is to take a quality approach, a quality framework approach, and we recognize the work that QIP have done in this space, where they're a quality services agency, and they said, look at a service philosophy, self-assessment, and then identify areas for improvement. We've taken that same process and mapped it on compliance, self-assessment tools that yourselves can use, and identify the areas for improvement as well too, and that feeds into your COVIDSafe plan. Now, yourselves might already have a COVIDSafe plan in place. That's great. You can then use the tools that we have for the work health and safety works around this to manage that as well. And again, following a quality cycle allows you to effectively run this self-assessment. And we've found that a lot of agencies have started to do this. So essentially, I'll summarize this down for you in terms of where the legislation comes from and what the directives are around what a COVIDNormal workplace looks like. Essentially, you've got your biosecurity legislation, which is still in place around that. You've got your public health and wellbeing legislation around the country. That provides directives from the Commonwealth, which we will run through. There's about 14 of those directives, as well as checklists issued by Safe Work Australia around what you actually need to look at from your own COVIDSafe plan workplace side. You might also have a pandemic plan that your state health department looks at, and this essentially pours into your self-assessment and identifies the area or gaps that you need to look at as well. Now, you'll find, I'll say, on one side, we've done the true, tried and tested works, which will show you what other agencies have done around this, to look at their checklists, to work out what can I do to keep my workers safe at the workplace. And this is really a key document for yourselves to use around it. It gives you the minimum requirements, and that's often what people ask us, what are the minimum requirements that we need to do? Well, we've got this legal compliance space to actually use to actually run this. Effectively, from that self-assessment, identifying the areas or gaps that you have will then update your COVIDSafe plan. Now, in terms of what you need to do to ensure you reduce the risk of COVID-19, there are essentially 14 different key points, and these are some of the take-home messages to actually look at. Now, this includes looking at policies, and this is directives coming from the Commonwealth. This is not something that we've just made up and pulled from, and we acknowledge that these are the sort of 14 areas that the Commonwealth Government have directed agencies to look at. And it's important to look at each of these 14 areas and then map that against your individual COVIDSafe plan space. And with it, you can pull the 1 through to 14 out. Some of these include ensuring social distancing, and this is some of the questions that people actually asked us around at the start of this, leading into this webinar. Whether you're from a religious group trying to organize social gatherings or dinners for guests or volunteers, or whether equally you're also trying to look at infection control guidelines in terms of your cleaning that you might have. Again, these are the 14 steps really to follow around it, and we'll show you how you can actually manage your compliance obligations. So this does include having policies, procedures to support employees working from home, looking at social distancing, discouraging carpooling, promoting good hygiene, and again, there are safe work guidelines on that as well. There's also the requirements to educate your staff about the early signs and symptoms, and that's what I mentioned Rumballara has done and Women's Housing has done as well too. And that's about screening, also ensuring what they do if they do identify those symptoms, and also developing policies that require staff to stay home if unwell as well. It also looks at undertaking frequent cleaning, and obviously the questions that come from that is, well, what does that look like? Okay, the Commonwealth may say you need to have frequent cleaning of workspaces, but what and when and how do I do that? Well, when you look at that, this is where you can actually pull information from Safe Work Australia around this. And they've got the guidelines and service maps around this to actually look at. Some of the complexities around this, though, then becomes, well, how do I then manage this information and bring it all together? And I'll show you what you can do to support that process as well. So when we look at it, how we've pieced this together is that you should be having your COVIDSafe Plan, which will give you your work health and safety directives and also meet your state health department requirements as well. You've also got your COVIDSafe plans and guideline documents that are issued from Safe Work, and looking at some of the forms that agencies should use. And if you're watching my mouse, this is what I'm actually focusing on here as well. So effectively running these three areas allow you to then make sure that your meeting and your agency is providing its legal compliance obligations in a COVIDSnormal world. Now, some of the questions that then come up is, well, what do some of the workplace laws mean and what do I need to know about? Well, let's start from the beginning around this and just go through these slides around this. With this, the first part is the planning the return to work. Just because the government restrictions are lifted, it means that you need to have a plan around, well, how do I bring my staff or personnel back? And before employers and employees return to work, it's important that businesses have a plan to keep their workplace safe, healthy, and free of coronavirus. This information here, we have lifted directly from the Fair Work website, and we acknowledge that openly around that. You'll find that some of the references within these slides, where we can, why not lean on the regulators, and we'll acknowledge those or the authors of this information equally during this session, because if we can do things rather than reinventing the wheel and bring this big jigsaw puzzle together for you, then that's what we'll do. So it's also important to review the plan, as Fair Work says, and regularly so that it stays up to date as restrictions change. And let's have a look at what that means. So as part of this planning, your agency, there is an expectation from Fair Work, need to consider your obligations on the work health and safety laws in each state and territory. And they talk about employers and employees working together. Now, there are parts of this that pay and leave conditions during coronavirus. You will need to look at annual leave requirements. You'll need to look at award flexibility in some cases as well too, with people coming to work. There have been questions that people have asked us of, if people feel unsafe at work, what do we do? And if it's a question that people want raised and answered again, happy to do that in today's session as well. Equally, there are also a number of awards that you need to consider that have specific changes to them. And we've listed these here for you as well too. So if you do fall into these areas, we'll be running other sessions throughout the next couple of weeks that will cover these, and more than happy to field answers around that as well. Equally, workplace laws are being driven and essentially it's being put as a positive duty on both employers and employees. So this means that firstly, employers need to make sure that their workplaces are safe. Equally, though, employees need to be able to follow those directions. So if you do have systems in place, they need to be able to follow it to support the safety and prevention of COVID-19 within the workplace itself. Now, some agencies have asked us around, can we ask and instruct, not instruct, direct is probably a more stronger word, employees to use the Commonwealth COVIDSafe app as a mandatory requirement? And quite simply, the answer is no. The COVIDSafe app is completely voluntary. Employees have workplace rights that protect them from adverse action in these circumstances. For example, employers can't fire an employee or change their job because the employee refuses to download or use the app. But I will come to ways in which agencies have done this in terms of screening their staff. Equally, stand down during a coronavirus. Employers may be able to stand down their employees during a coronavirus outbreak for a number of reasons. And this includes where the business has closed due to an enforceable undertaking. And that was potentially what was going to happen in Shepparton in a real life situation. Equally, if there's a stoppage of work due to the employee being affected by coronavirus, or if there's a qualifying employer legacy, employer uses JobKeeper and enabling stand down directions. So there are a number of options that you might have in the event that you are affected by the coronavirus, even though restrictions are being eased. Now, a couple of things I will mention, we have just briefly covered off, we'll cover off around before ending employment, some of the things that you need to consider as well too, and also whether and how you issue final pay. And I will just reference these slides here for yourselves. We will be covering this off in the upcoming weeks as well. We have had an important question around returning to the workplace, which I will just address here. We have just got a question from John just asking, can we ensure all customers and volunteers to take a temperature check before entering the sales or work areas? You can, John, if there is if you feel that that is necessary around that as well. We know that the temperature check is symptoms that agencies are screening for. We know some agencies are asking those questions already, and I'll show you that of what that actually looks like in a real life situation as well. Some agencies aren't doing it quite simply because of numbers of clients that or customers that they have, but they are doing a check of people and asking them to check in. So in the event that something comes up, that they are actually screening people as well. So that certainly is permissible to actually be able to do. I will just mention around the stand down of coronavirus, employers are able to stand down their employees if there is also an outbreak. So picking up on that, that is something that you can actually look at. Now, building upon John's important question around screening customers and also volunteers, it also brings us to the real life case studies that we're seeing with Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative and also Women's Housing Limited as well. Now, it is something that one of the things that has been raised, and I will just jump to this to show you, and I'll come back to it as well. Essentially, what we have seen around this is essentially agencies actually utilizing the dashboard to assist in the screening of staff as well, and also customers, which you might have seen in this. And let me show you what this actually real life looks like. What they have seen around this is this, where essentially they've turned around and said, we need to be able to screen our clients, and we need to be able to see our and record what is actually going on. And in the bottom left-hand corner, what you can see is basically a QR code. Now, these forms you might have seen actually at the some of the cafes and restaurants. And what I'm going to show you is how this actually works in a real life situation. So what I've just done is actually bring up my own phone on the screen for you. Quite simply, we can actually take a photo of this screen here, and with it, a link automatically comes up. Now, when that link comes up, what you're seeing is a live screenshot on my phone. So to answer your question, John, this is what some of our clients have done on the dashboard, and essentially it links back into the Gemba COVID system. So quite simply, this is women's housing around it. What they've done is they've asked them to, a person would actually come in, they would screen their person that's coming into their event, and I'll show you where they actually have a look at what's been done. Everyone, my phone number's been made public on Google, so I'm not showing you anything that is private here. And with it, they've asked them a series of questions. Now, these series of questions, these 10 questions are currently the screening questions that you're talking about. Someone can click on no, the reason for visiting the property, I'm going to say a test event around this, and any comments, no. So what we've done essentially is then run that and submitted that. Now, what you can see here is that it automatically comes up, and it's something that we've set up for women's housing. Essentially, what this does is automatically give you the registration of who's come in. It means then that you can quickly register those. It comes as, and it can be set up as part of your toolbox that you'll have access to today. And it allows you to actually do all of this and keep a register of your volunteers, of your customers, as they're coming in to your workplace as well. And it is quite simply very, very simple in terms of what we have done with Women's Housing Limited. And you can see that here. Equally, what we have also done with them is within it is give them access to their dashboard via the app. And again, staff can actually register for this process as well. So with it, when we look at who is actually responsible, you're right, John, in saying this, and we've had questions from other agencies, religious groups asking around, well, how can we actually run these requirements? How can we meet our events and register people into this system? How can we make sure that our people are kept safe around this? Well, quite simply, what you do have access to is essentially, which you will get, is a link that will take you onto your own Gemba 360 dashboard into it. You can click on the link, you will get access to it, and essentially what you've got is access to all the tools that I've been talking about today. Certainly, as part of this, it's a single seat to be able for yourselves to be able to do this. We have just been asked a question from David. Does the person with the phone have to download an app to use the QR code to prior to visiting? No, not at all, David. So with it, it actually links back to your Gemba dashboard with it. So the QR code, essentially people actually use the photo on this as part of that as well. They're just using their camera. It'll automatically bring up a link once they do that. And so by doing that, it'll actually even link in to their daily assessment forms, and you've got an immediate register of people answering the questions that you have as well too, and they can then link that information and answer those questions. It also means as part of that, that your COVIDSafe plan that you have is also then viewed into this place. And if you, for those agencies that have already got a COVIDSafe plan, you can already add to it, and you can go in and add your own information. However, if you needed to start from scratch, then what you do have is essentially the link that you can add in and action the 14 items directly out of the Commonwealth or even your state requirements as well. You've also got access to your policies documents. So if I type in, for example, policy, you'll have access to some of the template policies that your agency can actually start using around this as well. So essentially, by running out of the dashboard itself, you'll get access to these tools and resources and be able to utilize this as well. We'll follow that up for those agencies to give you access to the link around it, and with that, by tomorrow to access this dashboard and this resource as well. With it, let me jump back to the slides around this. As part of the recommendations, what we will show you is you need to look at, as part of moving into a COVID normal world, to have systems in place to be able to manage this reporting requirements as you move into this COVID safe space. You need to look at your policies and screening forms. And this is information that the Commonwealth has actually provided direction on, going right back to, I think, March, when those guidelines were released. In terms of monitoring and feedback, we've seen the ways in which agencies like Women's Housing has actually used their QR codes to link back to their Gemba dashboard to monitor those registrations around it. You can do the same thing. We can help you set those up as well too around it as well. You can also have access to your policy templates, which means that your agency can get COVID safe up and quickly within a few days as well. As I've mentioned, you do get access to your own COVID safe dashboard to commence working on this for one representative from your agency as well too. Obviously, there's a small licensing fee if you expand that out to other staff as well too. But look, we can set that up and help you with that. As I've mentioned, we've onboarded some a large number, over 2,000 agencies back in February, and that number has been repeated time and time again each time we run these webinars as well. And it's really there to support the public during this national pandemic that we are seeing. As part of your policies, these are the slides that we will be circulating and key points that you need to look at as well too. These slides will be made available, and you can look at these and ask us questions if you have your own policies as well. We will open up the phone lines, and more than happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that you might have. If you are watching this webinar after today's session, by all means, please contact us if you do have any questions on 1300 360 360, or email us at support@gemba360.com. Certainly, if you do wish to get your own login details to your own dashboard that you can use. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.